A face is looking up at you out of the dirt, black granite. The nose is intact, the eyes are intact, the mouth is set in the calm, closed half-smile that kings of the Nile wore for 3,000 years. But the neck ends in a break, and so do the legs, and the break is not weather, and it is not time. Somebody took this king apart with tools and intent, and then somebody laid the head down carefully and packed the earth around it so it would not be scratched. That pit was opened on the 11th of January 2003 at a place called Dukki Gel in northern Sudan. Charles Bonnet's team was clearing a temple when they hit it. 40 fragments of black granite came up out of the ground. Reassembled, they turned out to be 7 monumental statues, and every single one of them was a king. Taharqa, standing 2 meters 70, Tanwetamani, Senka Maniskan, Anlamani, Aspelta, the smallest, 1 meter 23. Everyone broken at the neck, everyone broken at the legs, every head protected. So who does that? Who hates a king enough to smash him and fears him enough to bury him gently? To find out, you have to go south. Further south than the Egypt you know. Follow the Nile upstream from Cairo, past Luxor, past the temples on the postcards, and keep going. The river starts to fight you. 6 times along its length, the bed turns to rock, and the water breaks into rapids that boats cannot pass. Those rapids are called cataracts, and for most of human history they worked like locked doors. So what was on the other side of them? What lay beyond them was a region the ancient world called Kush, and modern scholars call Nubia, and today is northern Sudan. Egypt spent centuries trying to hold that country down. It built mud-brick fortresses along the river to watch it. Around 1450 BCE, it conquered the Nubian capital at Kerma outright and put a new town on top of the ruin. And then Egypt got old. Have you ever wondered what a superpower actually looks like on the way down? By the 8th century BCE, the country you think of as one kingdom was not one kingdom at all. It had fractured into a scatter of local rulers, each of them calling himself king, each of them holding a few towns and a stretch of riverbank. The priesthood was its own power. The delta in the north was a patchwork. Behind the fourth cataract, meanwhile, something was rising. A line of rulers had established themselves at a city called Napata, in the shadow of a flat-topped sandstone mountain, Gebel Barkal, which both Egyptians and Nubians believed the god Amun lived inside. Where these kings got their idea of kingship from is one of the real open questions in the field. Timothy Kendall has argued for Egyptian priests at Napata, teaching them, while Laszlo Turok, Stuart Tyson Smith and others argue for centuries of slow two-way influence with no single moment of transmission. And the honest answer is that nobody has settled it. What is not in question is what they did next. They did not start with an army. They started with a daughter. A Kushite king named Kashta arranged for his daughter Amenirdes to be adopted at Thebes as the god's wife of Amun. A religious office that came with enormous land, wealth and authority in southern Egypt. It was inherited by adoption rather than by birth. So one adoption, done correctly, handed a Kushite family the keys to Upper Egypt without a single spear being thrown. How many conquests do you know that began in a temple, with a paperwork problem? Then came Piye. Piye took the throne around 747 BCE, though you should know that published dates for this dynasty's beginning range from 754 all the way to 722, depending on which scholar you read. 20 years into his reign, roughly 728 or 727 BCE, a prince named Tefnakht of Sais began pulling the Delta rulers into a coalition and pushing south. Piye came north to meet him, and he wrote it down. In 1862, at the Amun temple at the foot of Gebel Barkal, a great round-topped slab of grey granite was found. A stela, that just means an inscribed stone monument set up to be read. Auguste Mariette published it in 1872, and Emmanuel de Rouget produced a full translation in 1876. It sits in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo today, and it is one of the most detailed accounts of a military campaign to survive from the ancient world. Piye names his enemies one by one. He describes ordering his troops to wash in the Nile and put on clean linen and pray before they fight, because he is not framing this as a conquest at all. He is framing it as a holy war, ordered by Amun, to put a broken country back in order. Then he wins. And then he does the thing nobody expects. He goes home. Does that sound like a man who wanted to be Egyptian? Piye took the whole Nile Valley and then went back to Napata to live. And when he died, he was buried at a cemetery called El Kuru, under a pyramid, the first ruler on the Nile to be buried that way in roughly 800 years. Egypt had stopped building royal pyramids centuries earlier. A Kushite king restarted it. There is a detail from El Kuru that tells you more about these people than any inscription. When George Reisner excavated the site in 1919, he found, 140 meters from the royal graves, 24 pits arranged in 4 neat rows. In them were horses, buried standing up, still wearing their harness. Measured, the skeletons average around 1.55 meters at the shoulder. Large animals, large even by modern standards. 4 rows, 4 generations of kings. These were not people copying a culture they half understood. These were people who bred better horses than anyone around them and buried them like soldiers. So why has nobody ever told you their names? Now hold that in your head, because the greatest of them is coming. Taharqa took the throne in 690 BCE, and he built like a man who intended to be permanent. Go to Karnak in Egypt today, into the vast first court, and you will see a single enormous column standing by itself. That is his. It was one of 10, each about 21 meters tall, forming a kiosk he put at the entrance of the most important temple complex in Egypt. It is still the tallest standing column on the site. He built temples at Kawa. He decorated at Sanam. He built at Gebel Barkal, back home. His stone is scattered across 2 countries. What does a foreign occupier look like exactly when he spends 20 years repairing your temples? And his family were not demolishing Egyptian tradition. They were preserving it. The Shabaka stone in the British Museum was carved on the orders of Taharqa's predecessor, and it is the only surviving version of an ancient Memphite religious text, a Kushite king making sure an old Egyptian idea did not die. You have probably met Taharqa before without knowing it. He is Taharqa in the Hebrew Bible, in the 2nd book of Kings, and in Isaiah, the king of Kush who marches out against the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 701 BCE. Whether he was actually there is genuinely argued. He did not become king until 690, so scholars are split between those who think he commanded as a young prince and got given his later title by the writer, and those who think 2 separate events have been compressed into one. But the Assyrians were coming, that part is not in doubt at all. They came in 673 BCE and Taharqa beat them. They came back in 671 under Esarhaddon, and this time Memphis fell. Taharqa escaped south. His crown prince, a boy named Ushanhuru, did not. Neither did his wives or his court. They were taken north into Assyria as hostages. Archaeologists digging at the palace at Nineveh, in what is now Iraq, found fragments of colossal statues of Taharqa at the entrance. War trophies hauled 1,500 kilometers to stand at a foreign king's door. How do you come back from that? He came back anyway. Esarhaddon died in 1669 while marching to Egypt for a 3rd time, and Taharqa retook Memphis. Then Ashurbanipal came. In 667 Taharqa was beaten again and fled south. He died in 1664. His nephew Tanwetamani made one last attempt, retook Memphis, and in 663 the Assyrian army marched all the way to Thebes and sacked it. A catastrophe so total that a Hebrew prophet was still using it as a byword for ruin half a century later. A local ruler named Psamtik was installed in the north as a vassal. The Kushite century was over, but the erasure had not started yet. That came 70 years later, and it came from Egypt. In 593 BCE, in his 3rd year on the throne, Psamtik II sent an army south. Egyptians under a general named Amasis, plus Greek and Carian mercenaries under another. You can still read their graffiti. The mercenaries scratched their names into the leg of a colossal statue of Rameses II at Abu Simbel, boasting about how far up the river they had gone. They sacked Napata, they looted its temples. And then, back in Egypt, they went around the country with chisels. The names of the Kushite kings were hacked out of their statues and reliefs. The royal emblems were cut away. Not the buildings, in most cases, just the identity, just the name, which in Egyptian belief was the part of you that had to survive for you to survive. Do you see what that means? It was not enough to defeat them, they had to be unmade. Now go back to that pit at Dukki Gel, 7 kings smashed at the neck and the legs, buried with their heads protected. That break is very likely this campaign, and the care is not kindness, it is caution. These were sacred objects, and the people burying them were destroying a king's power while still believing that power was real. That is the first erasure, deliberate, ancient, done with tools. The second one took much longer, and it was done with sentences. Between 1913 and 1932, a Harvard archaeologist named George Reisner, working for the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, excavated more of ancient Nubia than anyone before or since. Kerma, Gebel Barkal, Nuri, El Kuru, Meroe. He found the horse burials. He found the hidden entrances to the Nubian pyramids that had defeated everyone else. He built the greatest collection of Nubian material outside Egypt and Sudan, and he read almost all of it backwards. Standing in the ruins of Kerma, looking at a genuinely Nubian city, Reisner concluded it was an Egyptian outpost, and he wrote about the people who built it in terms that flatly denied them the capacity to have built it. Fine objects were Egyptian, crude ones were Nubian. That was the rule he worked by. And if that is your rule, what could a Nubian city possibly show you that would change your mind? It held for decades. It began to break when a Swiss archaeologist, Charles Bonnet, started digging at Kerma in 1970 and kept going back every year. He found houses, workshops, palaces, a major African city as early as 2000 BCE. He has said plainly that Western archaeologists were looking for Egypt in Sudan instead of looking for Sudan in Sudan. It took roughly 20 years for the field to accept him. The museum has since said it out loud. In its own galleries, the Museum of Fine Arts has stated that Reisner's prejudices led him to misinterpret his findings and that he had it almost entirely backward. That an army from Kerma very likely raided Egypt and carried the fine objects home, exactly the reverse of what he assumed. Here is what that neglect actually looked like in practice. The MFA did not open a dedicated Nubian gallery until 1992. It closed in 2006, and Reisner never published his work at Nuri at all. An associate assembled what documentation existed into a report in 1955, and then the site sat. So does that story end there, with a wrong that got named? Not quite, because of what happened next. In January 2019, an expedition at Nuri, led by the archaeologist Piers Paul Kriesman, dug out a 65-step processional staircase cut down into the bedrock beneath a pyramid. 40 steps down, they hit water. Sudan's water table has risen, and the burial chambers of Nuri are flooded. So they put on dive gear and swam in. It was the first underwater archaeology ever done in Sudan. The tomb belonged to Nastasen, one of the last kings buried at the site, who died around 315 BCE. They found offerings still in place, small figures that had been covered in gold leaf. The material beneath had dissolved in the water. The gold was still there, floating in the dark. And do you know how they knew where to dig? And the maps they used to find the stair in the first place were Reisner's field notes. The man who buried the story kept the records that are digging it back out. His notebooks, his photographs, his measurements, meticulous, obsessive, and now in the hands of people asking better questions than he did. Bonnet used the same archive to overturn him at Kerma. Which brings you to now, and to why this is urgent, rather than merely interesting. Sudan has been at war since April 2023. UNESCO reports more than 100 cultural sites damaged and at least 22 museums looted or destroyed. The director of Sudan's antiquities body has said that roughly 90% of the National Museum's holdings were destroyed. The temple sites at Naka and Musawarat es Sufra are ringed by landmines. At the pyramids of Meroe, monitoring has almost entirely stopped. People climb the monuments, write on them, and the sand comes in. You know the pyramids of Egypt. There are somewhere around 120 to 140 of them. There are more in Sudan. Depending on how you count, somewhere between 200 and 255. More pyramids than Egypt. Almost no one watching them. How many times does one civilization have to be erased? So think about that head again, resting in the dirt at Dukki Gel, packed round with earth by someone who wanted it gone and could not quite bring himself to let it be damaged. It stayed down there for 2,500 years. It came up with the face still on it. That is what the record actually does. Not disappear, wait. And the only question that has ever mattered is whether anyone comes back, gets the sand off and looks at it properly this time.